Welcome to the Big Ideas Talk series. Today we are joined by Mr. Shuvam Misra, who is a veteran of the software services industry, having spent nearly 30 years in the field. He is one of the pioneering early movers of open source software in the Indian financial services sector. He is the founder of a successful mid-sized software company called Remiges. So thank you so much for joining us. My first question to you is, India has a heavy adoption of open source software. We can see that Linux adoption is widespread, and Indian software companies have millions of engineers who have developed software on the LAMP stack, where MySQL, PHP, Java, Postgres, etc. are heavily used. What are your views on this? Is there a what next? What more needs to be done?
This is very interesting that you talk about the heavy use of open source software components or platforms or frameworks for building custom applications. So the software projects industry worldwide, and that includes India, heavily uses open source software for all sorts of purposes, development, production. The place where India, I think, is seriously lacking is that compared to the amount of software that is developed in India, very little open source software is created in India. So I believe that we need to do something very fundamental to push the creation of open source software in India. Now, when we look at open source software, when we look at software being built, there are many motives, many factors which decide whether the creator or the owner wishes to release the software as open source. But I believe there is one major subset of the open source world, of the software development world, where this should not be difficult, and that is custom software built for any government client. So when software is built for a government client, the software has already been paid for by the citizens of India, which means it's taxpayers' money. That money has been spent. Now the output should be a public good. So that software should be released as open source.
So when you mentioned, you've spoken about the government, and it really gives me two questions. One is, do we have examples of the Indian government doing something like this? And secondly, wouldn't it be better to leave things like these to market forces? Wouldn't it be better to leave this outside the realm of government policy?
I don't see any reason to leave it outside government policy. If you do not make this a policy, then there is really not much motivation for the government department, the client of the software development, to take a stand either way. So they will allow things to run their course. And software vendors who are in the software services space often have relatively little motivation to push their client to release the software as open source. So they are in the business of work for hire, right? So they want more and more projects, and they want every project to give something to the client and let it be there. So it will be, I think, a much better idea if this can be done as a policy, as a sort of nationwide standard, that any software, any custom software built with taxpayer money should be released back into the open source world, so that all taxpayers and the entire world can then reuse it and benefit. So there are examples of this in other countries.
So the other question that we come up with is that there is this understanding that governments are supposed to enforce privacy in the data sphere, and wouldn't open source violate this requirement of privacy? Of course we cannot afford to have government files which are floating around in places where they shouldn't be.
This is a very good question, but it's a very common misconception. So see, we have to understand that the thing that needs to be private is the information inside a software application, which is data. The data needs to be private. The source code of the software doesn't need to be private, because the two have no connection with each other. If I know the full source code of the Aadhaar system, the UID AI system, it does not mean that I can get a single Aadhaar card data out of the system. The protection of the data is done by means which have no connection with my access to the source code. So this needs to be separated and understood very well. I don't know how many in the government understand it, but I'm 100% certain that the technical advisors and consultants and experts who work with the government understand this very well.
Sure. Sir, now that the government would come up with requirements of of software being open source, how is it then an attractive proposition for software companies? How do they earn revenue if we do this? Wouldn't there be a disincentive for software companies to pick up a government order?
This is again a very good question. It's a standard sort of line of thought. There is this belief among less technical people that if I'm building something, if I'm building software, I'm a software company, I'm building software for one client, if that client publicly makes available the software I have built, then how can I go to my next client and build another software, because they will all be copying software legally from each other? The answer is that it doesn't really work like that. It is true that in theory, if the Nagpur Municipal Corporation builds an application, then it is in theory possible that the Nasik Municipal Corporation or the Aurangabad Municipal Corporation may be able to use the same software with very little modification. But then the question that comes up is, who are we batting for? What is our home team? Am I worried about the software services companies, or am I worried about taxpayer money? Wouldn't our first responsibility as a government be towards maximization of productivity of taxpayer funds? So according to me, that question is moot. It's not a very important question. The second point is, software always needs to be modified, needs to be adapted. So even if there are 5 customers who need pretty much very similar software, it will have to be partly redone for each customer. So there is enough work to go around and lots of revenue.
So you said earlier about how when Indian taxpayers are indirectly paying for a software that has been procured by the government of India, Indian taxpayers should have access to it, and that is a important and valid point. But what about those who aren't Indians? What do we gain by allowing them to have access to the open source code?
So this is partly a matter of strategy and positioning, and partly a matter of straight out worldview. So I'll answer at 2 levels. Okay, at the level of strategy, it is fantastic that the government of India makes available the software that it builds as a repository, as a khazana for worldwide benefit, worldwide good. Okay. According to me, the soft power that the government of India, that the country can get, the brand that the country can build by making available what will arguably be the world's largest government software repository, is fantastic. Imagine the kind of goodwill which will be like a halo behind every government agency, every technical agencies, glowing behind their heads when they walk into any international forum and say, we are from that country which has made available the world's largest body of software for public use. So that is at the level of strategy and brand building and just international relations. And there is another level also. Finally, is there, other than defense, other than national security, is there any need to draw boundaries between countries? No. And we have learned so much from the software which others have made available in the open source world. Isn't it high time that we give something back? So this is my view.
Absolutely, sir. And on the last point, how do we implement or how do we, in the Indian context, get an idea like this to move from
to actually put it into execution?
Is it?
Yes. This is a very interesting point, because we have seen some hits and misses on this front. So let me clarify one point. There is this belief that once I decide to make the software available as open source, all I need to do is take my source code, copy it into some public server and provide the URL to the world, and they will beat a path to the door because, oh, it is so valuable. I may have spent 1 crore or 10 crores or 100 crores to get the software developed. Now the source code is available and the whole world will just love me for it. Doesn't work like that. Okay. So what are the things that we need to do to make sure that the so-called asset which I am making available is genuinely valuable? The first thing that needs to be made available is all the documentation that went into the building of the software. So not just the source code, but all the documentation, all the specifications, all the details. The second thing that needs to be made available, where I think there have been some government projects which have missed the mark, is the ability to build and test the software. So if I have a large unfamiliar piece of software, look at it as a recipient. I am a recipient. I am downloading some software. It is open source. It is legally quite visibly open source, but I don't know much about it. The minimum that I want to do is download the software on my computer, build it, as in make the binaries out of the source code, and then do some trial runs with it and verify that it actually works. So this has to be made available with the source code by the provider. So what does that mean? That means a build system. So what I am very specifically recommending is that with every source code repository, there also has to be, in modern terminology, a software container with all the build tools and the build automation configuration to build that source code into a binary. So what I am at a bits and bytes level, what I am strongly proposing is that if this policy is put into effect, let us say there is a large software vendor who's building software for, say, a government department. They deliver the software, the government department starts using it, but for that, the vendor builds the software and gives the binaries to the client. So the government department doesn't care about the source code. They want the software working, which is the binary. That is the form in which traditionally a vendor delivers software to the client. I am saying now, in addition to that, they must give a full source code in the repository, and they must deliver a software container. You know, the container technology like Kubernetes and Dockers and so on. They must give a ready-made software container which contains all the build tools correctly configured such that the customer or any third party can click one button and build the whole binary from the source code. So source code, documentation and build container, these three have to be delivered. Then I think we can genuinely say that we are offering an asset whose value can be tapped by others.
So thank you so much for sharing these great ideas with us today.
Thank you so much. Great.